Good evening and welcome to Casa Italiana for a program co-presented with Centro, Primo, Levi and the University of Rome, La Sapienza. So tonight is an offspring of a seminar that we're holding during these days, dedicated to a Roman poet. His name is Immanuel of Rome, and he is also known as Manuelo Giudeo in as many other ways, 6 names. Who lived during the lifetime of Dante and has often been called the Jewish Dante. He's a very fascinating figure who has been published and studied throughout the centuries by many different scholars and poets and lovers of poetry. And who in reality has remained kind of on the margin of the public discourse of the broader knowledge on the Middle Ages and of medieval poetry. We're very fortunate to have a panel of scholars who study Immanuel and the period in which Immanuel lived from different viewpoints. And very much of the aim of this seminar was to zoom in not so much on the poet, although we'll tell a little bit of the story of his life, the way he recounts it, but also to zoom in on the different environments with which he was in contact. He lived at a time when Rome was in great turmoil, and in which influences from the south and from the north were equally strong and important, and also created a series of watersheds in the arts, in the politics, in the warfare, in the balance of power at the time. So we'll start with inviting Isabelle Levy, who has written extensively about Immanuel the poet and has done very interesting research on the Arabic models, the models in Arabic poetry that he uses, that among the many different models that he adopts and he uses in his writing. And we'll tell a little bit about what Immanuel left, what information Immanuel left about his own life, what transpires in his writing about who he was, where he lived, and what he did. So please welcome Isabelle Levy from Columbia University, who will start the program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalia. Thank you, NYU, Casa Italiana, and Centro, Primo, Levi, and also University of Rome, La Sapienza, for allowing this interesting group to come together to talk about a lesser-known poet. So I wanted to say just briefly a few things because we know very little. And what we know comes from Immanuel's own words, and that is a tricky and slippery slope. So we know that he lived in Rome. We know that because that's how he goes by, Emanuele Romano. We know in the manuscript tradition can be referred to as Manuelo Giudeo, Manuelo da Gubbio. That is perhaps because he spent some time in Gubbio he exchanged sonnets with Bosone da Gubbio. He might have traveled to other places, Fermo, Ancona, Fabriano, Verona, and we know these places also from his fictional writings, which were many. He wrote extensively both in Hebrew and Italian, more so in Hebrew than Italian. The Hebrew works include, as Natalia mentioned, what stems from an Arabic style genre called the Makama, that was adopted for use in Hebrew and among Jews living in Christian Spain as early as the 12th century with Ibn Sakbal. but then came into use mostly in the 13th century, and that was Immanuel's time. And he wrote these a collection of 28 stories in Hebrew with rhymed prose with interspersed rhymed metered poems, and each story deals with a different topic, ranging from philosophy to language to parody to love, and then there are his biblical commentaries, which were almost encyclopedic commentaries on nearly the entire Bible, that drew on previous commentators and colleagues. And in addition to that, we have the sonnets in Italian and one strophic poem that is kind of like a ballad, also in Italian, with some very unusual onomatopoeia that seemed to be words that he liked and made up for the purpose of this beautiful poem. And these Italian poems exist in 6 early modern manuscripts and appear just so, surrounded by poems by the most famous poets of the period of the Duecento. So you will see him surrounded by Dante, Cavalcanti, Guinizelli, and Emanuele Romano. So that's why we're here to discuss this fascinating figure. And what is really interesting is that the narrative we know is really his own, and that's tricky. But what can we do to bolster that with historical knowledge based on what we know? We know more now. So how can we flesh out what we know about him by coming together as a group of comparative thinkers who come from different fields, from Arabic, Latin, historical perspectives. And so that's what really the goal of this, to try to figure out more about this enigmatic poet. So thank you.
Thank you, Isabelle. So maybe we should add a little bit. I mean, Immanuel lived in Rome, was born and lived in Rome. Rome had a community, a Jewish community of some kind that probably was very different from anything that we think as a Jewish community in the in later periods. We don't know exactly how it was structured. We can imagine that, had a distributed in some areas of the city that had a leadership that, and we can say that Immanuel belonged to a cultivated class. It was clearly, was related to a famous philosopher and translator, Yehuda Romano, mentions in his stories, other poets who are in the Jewish circle like Yehuda Siciliano and other and in the non-Jewish intellectuals of his time, is mentioned, he corresponds and is mentioned, by important Christian poets. So we have a little, we have his own narrative, but also we have a little bit of connection, and we know quite a lot about who came to Rome, how did these Jews in Rome live? What did they do? What did they study? How did they relate to the rest of the city? So this part of the story, I'm going to invite Fabrizio Lelli of the University of Roma La Sapienza, who has been here many times, and has always, I have to say, enchanted our audience with this, bringing us back to those to times past, to tell us a little bit about, particularly, because Isabelle mentioned, Immanuel used these Arabic models of poetry, where he also used, he had a still novistic vein, and he wrote in many different ways, and also he wrote in vernacular and in Hebrew. And the environment of Rome was strongly influenced by Jewish cultural environment from the south of the peninsula. And also, in the time immediately preceding Immanuel's life, the center of the axis of the empire was really south, was in Sicily, rather than what will become, later on in the north. And Immanuel lives through, during this shift of power and shift of balance, but a lot of culture was coming from the south. And so I'll ask Fabrizio, who has studied these things for so many years, to guide us a little bit through this, conjure a little bit of that environment.
So, thank you, Natalia, for your enchanting words, and I'm very thankful because I feel I'm very, to be honest, I'm overwhelmed because there's so much to say, and so let's start from something different. May I start from something different, something that you probably know of? I don't know. If you know, if you don't know, let me know. I'll try to explain that. Okay? There's a peculiar motif in Immanuel's poetry that you might be familiar with, and this is the motif of the angel woman, or angelic woman. Have you ever heard of this? So this is something that appears in poetry and is related to, maybe Isabelle can of course introduce us to some erotic poetry of the period, of the previous periods and so on. And this motif was very popular in Provence. And it might have derived from treatises on love, which circulated in France and in the regions beyond the Alps, but also in Muslim Spain. So it was a very popular topic. How to describe a woman in poetry, and how to make a real woman, a woman in flesh and blood, so to say, a sort of angel, a sort of divine power, a sort of emanation, of divine emanation, okay? Why should they do so? This is a very complex question, and Immanuel somehow tries to give some answer to this question, because at the same time he deals with lively, real women in his poetry. I mean, women that attract him, physically attract him, women that really are the object of his desire. And this is one of the reasons why his poetry has been defined too much erotic, and sometimes has been even charged with sort of heresy, because it's too much, it's too explicit, so to say. But on the other hand, the same women that appear to be so sensual, so earthly, so to say, are endowed with some sort of grace. And this grace comes from above, comes from God, okay? So that we may understand, like in Provençal poetry, and not only Jewish poetry, but also non-Jewish poetry, and in some forms of Arabic poetry, which was very common in Andalusia, in Spain, we may understand that this depiction of woman didn't want to aim at a real woman. but it was a sort of metaphor for some sort of intellectual understanding of God. So this is very interesting for Immanuel, in my viewpoint, because, as we have said, Immanuel was at the same time a poet, but also a philosopher, and a very important interpreter of the Bible, of the Hebrew Scripture. And many interpreters before him and in his generation were making an effort to provide specific sections of the Bible which are very earthly, with divine interpretations, with divine with a specific divine understanding. This is, I think you are familiar with the Song of Songs. I mean, you know about the Song of Songs, and you should know that the Song of Songs has been considered as the most sacred of all poems, although it is indeed a very erotic poem in itself. And so, for instance, Immanuel wrote a commentary on the Song of Songs, and the idea of commentaries on the Song of Songs, like for Immanuel, and the same happened with his predecessors, was to demonstrate that the woman of the Song of Songs was a sort of divine presence, a sort of how to express that in a simple word, something like I don't want to use technical words, but something that connected man and mankind to God. So the function, so to say, the use of this divine woman was very important, because without this mediation, man could not attain, could not reach up to God. Okay? So this is very interesting, because what Immanuel does, and which was kind of popular in his generation, was to create links between real women, earthly women, and these, so to say, intellectual interpretation of a sort of divine woman who acted as a mediating power between God and man. Okay? And this is very important for me, because you might have heard of a very central concept in rabbinic interpretation of Judaism, which is the concept of the Shekhinah. Do you know? Have you heard of the Shekhinah? You know what Shekhinah is? Shekhinah can be considered as the presence of God beside the people of Israel, along with the people of Israel. Okay? So as long as there was a temple in Jerusalem, and the temple was standing in Jerusalem, the Shekhinah, the presence of God, dwelled in the temple of Jerusalem. But since the temple was destroyed at some point, this Shekhinah had to leave, to quit, to abandon the temple. And the only way for the community of Israel to be in touch, to maintain a link, a strong connection with God, was in hoping that this Shekhinah would come closer to the community of Israel, instead of fleeing, of going up in heaven and reaching up to God. Okay? So the idea of this woman, which is the object of the songs of Immanuel, is somehow the idea of the Shekhinah, okay? And this is very important because it's a way to understand a very strong central concept of rabbinic Judaism and a very strong intellectual concept in medieval philosophy according to poetic categories which were very common in the Middle Ages. What I want to say is that although Immanuel seems to be only using metaphors or literary motifs when he praises women's love, he actually draws upon a very ancient tradition, which is at the same time philosophic, intellectual, and religious. And to come back to what Natalia wanted me to say, maybe, and that I probably didn't say, I don't know. I just want to say some very interesting way, but again, I'm just talking as usual, and I'm talking about my interests and my idea of interpretation of Immanuel, of course, which might be good or not, I don't know. Anyway, there is a very interesting thing that happened in Rome, exactly in the period of Immanuel's life, and had to do with a sort of liturgical understanding of prayer, which was new in those days in the Roman community, in the Jewish Roman community. And this new understanding of liturgy had to do with this conceptual understanding of the Shekhinah. So by praying, you attracted the Shekhinah down on earth, in a way, which was something very common in some mystical forms of Jewish thought in the Middle Ages, but became specifically central to the daily life and the liturgic life of the Jewish community of Rome right in the time of Immanuel. Okay? So sometimes Immanuel, just to conclude what I wanted to say, and I don't know if you understand anything of what I've said, but the idea is that he seems to be, Immanuel, Isabelle was rightly saying, he's an enigmatic person. And he's generally been considered as a joyful poet, someone who plays with words, who makes puns, who plays with words. He's a very profound thinker, and he's very much knowledgeable about religion, about religious texts, and of course about the Bible, since, as we've heard, he commented upon it, and he could turn something which seems to be so earthly into something which is so high. Okay, and this, in my opinion, is the talent of Immanuel. Okay, you read his poems, you read his Hebrew sonnets especially, and you are enchanted, you are attracted by what he says. Exactly like you are, I hope you know, you are attracted when you read Dante's sonnets. Okay, with the major difference that in Immanuel, you have a larger intellectual production to take into account in order to understand it. I think that's my understanding of this issue. So, open to question. I hope you understood what I've said. If you haven't understood a single word, please raise your hands and say something, please. Please.
Thank you, Fabrizio. This was wonderful. And if I may add a small, I don't want to add to the wonderful things you said, but we're also at a time of great political turmoil and great shifts of power, and the understanding of who has the power and who has the knowledge is very difficult to grasp from our perspective of a global society. And the woman and the Enlightenment also have, I think, a reflection. I mean, are also interpreted as knowledge, because it is God that gives us knowledge, and people had a tremendous need. This was a very small society where poetry, literature, knowledge, scientific knowledge circulated in very small circles and in very large areas. And this, I think, it brought together the means that people had, that were religious, or like a platform that was spiritual, with needs that had different more immediate goals. So I think that this is very, very interesting and important in Immanuel. So going back to Rome, now I'm not going to ask anybody to tell a story, but I will invite Dario Internullo, who is from the University of Rome, La Sapienza, and has written marvelous essays and books about Rome of those years, and not Jewish Rome specifically, but the city where he can illuminate for us where, the city where Immanuel lived, which was so different from what we can imagine today. And please welcome Dario Internullo.
Thank you, Natalia, and good evening to all. So I would start with Immanuel, because as Isabelle said, he wrote several vernacular poems, and in two of his Italian poems, he said something about two families coming from Rome, Colonna and Orsini. And Immanuel says, I don't want to belong neither to Colonna nor to Orsini, but my question is, who were Colonna and Orsini? And as a historian of the city of Rome, I probably say two words about the urban context in which Immanuel lived, and what was Rome in the time of Immanuel. We know many things about Rome in this period, thanks to many scholars, starting to a French book published in 1973, coming from the Annales of Histoire économique et sociale School of Paris, and I'm referring to Pierre Toubert. And after this turn, many scholars devoted themselves to the study of Roman society. So, relying on their studies, I can say that Rome in the late Middle Ages was a big city. The city wall was probably the biggest city wall in Italy and in Europe, but wasn't new because Romans lived in the ancient infrastructure. So the city wall was the Aurelian wall, the wall projected, planned by the Emperor Aurelian in the 3rd century. And in general, the infrastructure was the ancient one. This was enough for Romans of the late Middle Ages because they were less than in the antiquity. We know that in antiquity Rome reached around 500,000 of inhabitants. We know that in the time of Immanuel, Rome had around 80,000 inhabitants, far less than in antiquity, but Rome was a big city, even if we compare it with the best cities of Europe in the same period. For example, Paris, 100,000 inhabitants, or Florence or Milan, 100,000 inhabitants. So, all this to say that Roman society was really complex. But thanks to the studies of the scholars, of many historians deriving from French school Annales, we know today many things about the structure of the society. And we know that the society was divided into 3 big groups. 2 groups were the nobles of the city, and the 3rd big group was the non-elite group. The first 2 were named noble in the written sources, but were divided into 2 subgroups. The peculiarity of Rome was to have two groups of nobles. The nobility was bipartite, as said one of these scholars, Sandro Carocci. At the first step, there was a very strong group of nobles, the so-called Baroni di Roma, Roman barons. At the second group, there were the noble named milites or cavalieri, because their common feature was to fight as knights in the communal army. And the third big group, the popolo, was simply composed by the productive classes, the hand workers, the iron workers, fishmonger, and so on. I started with Colonna and Orsini because they belonged to the barons. And the barons were the ruling class of Rome in the time of Immanuel. The barons were a very tiny group of 10 families, and their peculiarity was to have strong relationships, strong links with the papacy, the probably one of the most powerful bishops in Europe, and this connection to the papacy granted them a considerable wealth, and the wealth of the barons, Colonna and Orsini and other families, was composed by castles, castra in Latin. Castles were fortified villages spread around central Italy, and it was the core of the wealth of the baron, because to own a castle meant to own like 200 or 300 peasants, and these peasants were ready to fight if you had necessity, to fight with your rival noble family, or even to fight with another city. So Colonna and Orsini were able to raise very large armies. And why I'm saying this? Because they were important also in the political scenario of Rome. And one of the best results of the recent research on Rome is that now we can say that Rome was a communal city, was not only the seat of the papacy, but was also a city with a lay government, the commune. You know, probably Italian history and the city communes in all other cities of central and northern Italy. Now we know that Rome was a commune itself. The only difference between Rome and other cities is that in Rome the commune is named not comune with the Latin term of other cities, but as an acronym of 4 letters, SPQR, which you find even today when you walk around Rome. And this means SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanus. Precisely, the government was ruled by figures named senatores. But why Populusque Romanus? Because the power of the senators was legitimized by the people, the popolo, the urban community in the broader sense of the term. The peculiarity of the politics of the commune in the period of Immanuel is that the barons' families dominated the political scene. So we know that if a person wanted to say something or to be active in the political arena, he was forced to enter in a network named parts or faction dominated by one of the 2 families. So if you wanted to be important in politics, you had to enter into a network dominated by the Colonna or Orsini. So I conclude about Immanuel. Immanuel says, I don't want to belong to Colonna and Orsini. And this is important because if we compare his poems with the literature produced by other Romans, Immanuel is one of the first Romans to propose to go beyond the problem of the networks, the noble networks. And he proposed a new political solution. And in this, I find him really important because he anticipates the ideas of Cola di Rienzo, who, at the mid-14th century, he proposed a revolution. He exiles the barons from the city, And he can fulfill a project with a government in which the popolo was the protagonist and the barons were set aside. So Immanuel is important even from this point of view, but I don't want to say nothing more because we have other friends saying more about imperial party or the political solutions proposed by Immanuel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dario. Now we know a little bit about where Immanuel lived. And I'm going to invite Davide Liberatoscioli. Not the right accent. Liberatoscioli from Postdam. I will work on the accent from the University of Postdam, and who will talk a little bit about this role of Immanuel, how this poet, who is relatively, again, not really considered by historians, political historians, had in fact political views that transpires through his work. So please welcome Davide Liberatoscioli.
Good evening. Thank you for the introduction and for inviting me. I'm starting from what Dario said about the conflicts that shook the Roman commune, like other central and northern Italian communes between the 13th and the 14th century. And I want to add something about Jews and the role Jews played within these conflicts. Historiography generally assumes that Jews did not participate to politics, neither to theoretical discussions, nor to civic administration or to the construction of political identities. I think this is not true. Documents witness that between the 13th and the 14th century, Jews were perceived, maybe not all Jews, but a conspicuous number of Jews in central and northern Italian cities were perceived as active part of political life. They were referred to with political adjectives like Guelf and Ghibellin, Guelfo and Ghibellini. There are, for example, 2 Jews in Perugia in 1377 who were described in official acts of the city like very Guelfi, true supporters of the Popol faction. And maybe the most interesting case of Jewish engagement in politics is Immanuel of Rome. I argue that some passages of his works can be interpreted as political support for the imperial party. Among these passages, the most peculiar is from the Bisbides, which is an Italian poem, a poem in Italian vernacular, which represents a playful and supportive description of the court of Cangrande della Scala in Verona. And it's important to consider that Cangrande is imperial vicar and main champion of the imperial party in those years. And in this poem, Immanuel gives a description of the imperial political theories. And he says that under the wise guidance of the emperor and his vicar, possible to reach a harmony among the naciones, among the nations, and like the German, the Italian, the Latin, the Italian, and the French ones. And most important, in another passage, Immanuel mentions Jews and Muslims among the naciones that coexist at the court, in harmony at the court of Can Grande della Scala. So this reflects the contemporary political theories developed by imperial philosophers, namely that the imperial power should embrace the entire world, all individuals independently on the religious affiliation, not only the Christians but also pagans and Jews and Muslims. Concluding, in his works, Immanuel transposed the capability of all humans, thanks to their reason, to participate in a perfect political system on earth under the guidance of the emperor, independent from their religious affiliation. And this is something new that, in my opinion, should be stressed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Davide. This is quite important also because it's the new approach to this topic. I think it would be important to say that when we talk about French, Italian, German, we're talking about an area that precedes our national borders and the way in which we intend these words today. And on the same topic, and we're talking very much about languages and vernacular languages as languages that came from other languages like Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, languages that were used by elite at another, in a previous time as main means of communication, of ruling, of economic trades, and it trickled down into vernacular languages that slowly started to take their own characters in different parts of the world. And so we have here Karla Mallette, who has made a history, a biography of these languages, how they behaved and what they meant, and how this process of passing from the global languages, so to speak, the Latin was the language of the empire, to other languages, and obviously the fact that people had to speak very often in all classes or level of society, multiple languages, early transient languages, and what this meant at that time. Something, we live in a society where learning languages is something, is a way to reach out to other cultures, to other people, but we come already from a very consolidated experience of segregation into monolingual nation states, except for Canada maybe or other, but so learning languages is a way out. But in this case, we are at a time when it's the reverse process. And Immanuel, like we see Dante, has questions. He has. Does he write in Latin? Does he write in vernacular? What does it mean? Who does he reach when he writes in different languages? And Immanuel faces the same issue with Hebrew. He writes in Hebrew and he writes in vernacular, but it's not easy to make a parallel and to understand what this means, who were these audiences, because when he writes in Hebrew, he doesn't only write biblical commentaries, he also writes about the Romans. And that's something that is a little disorienting. So I'm going to invite Karla Mallette, who wrote about Sicily, under Muslim rule and Frederick II, and wrote about many topics that pertain to this discussion. But her latest book is really about the life of these languages, Latin and Arabic. And please welcome Karla Mallette.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Natalia, and thank you for the invitation to come here and talk about somebody who I know nothing about, Immanuel Romano. When Natalia first asked me to come and give a talk at this, I was delighted to be invited. I mean, who doesn't want to be invited to New York City? But I replied, I can't accept this invitation. I know nothing about Immanuel. And Natalia did not take no for an answer, and said, but please, the invitation is to come and help, to think with others, to think with other comparatists, about this man who lived in multiple languages. And so I'm here, and I'm learning from everybody. I'm absorbing from all of you, all the people who I've heard so far present and who will continue to speak tomorrow. I'm learning about Immanuel and his world, and I'm learning about kind of how he lived in and with his languages. This is, these are the big questions that I was asking in the last book. When I really wanted to think about kind of language choice, I wanted to take as a proposal that when we take on a language of literature, we're making an active choice. We're kind of it's an ethical kind of decision that you make to engage in a language, to engage the history that spoke with that language in the past, and you're also choosing the future that you want to speak to when you're choosing a language. People who choose a language are typically investing in the future of that language. It's an act of faith, right? It's a vote of confidence in the future of that language. When you kind of are mindful of everything that we take on when we take on a language, and everything that we invest in a language when we use it as the literary medium in particular, then it helps you to kind of feel for the choice that people have made in the past, and feel for kind of the affection often that they had for the language that they took on. I think that that knowledge, thinking that way about the Tre Corone, about Dante and Petrarch and Boccaccio, made me see their engagements with language very differently, made me understand how they engage with and invest in their languages in a very different way. Immanuel, I think in some ways, is closest to Petrarch in the way that he engages with language, because he really put so much in his cosmopolitan language. He invested so much in his Hebrew. And he saw that Hebrew could do things that, as far as I can tell, as I've learned from you all in the last day or so, others did not necessarily see that potential in Hebrew, right? So he was really pushing Hebrew to do things that others maybe didn't use it in the same way that he did. He was sort of a visionary in Hebrew. And then Italian was something that he wrote for his bros. Italian was something that he wrote for his peers and contemporaries, and he wrote, kind of to engage with people who were men of letters like him. He was witty in Italian, but he didn't have the same kind of investment in its future. He didn't have the same kind of investment in Italian that he had in Hebrew. Although Isabelle suggested that, if I'm not mistaken, that maybe the bis bidis was a kind of a Makama that was, or something, or steps toward a Makama that was written in Italian rather than in Hebrew. So Immanuel, who had written Hebrew Makamat, essentially, in the Mahbarot, was actually kind of pushing Italian, possibly, in the same direction in the Bispidis. So if I understood this conversation right. So this has already got me thinking in a new way about how to read that poem, right? And where Immanuel might have been going with it. I'm not saying that he got there, but where he might have been going with it. And so this is what's been in the back of my mind as I've been thinking about Immanuel and listening and learning from all of the talks that I've heard so far. And what I'm going to talk about some other things tomorrow when we reconvene to continue the conversations. But I also think and I'll close with this. I think that of the Tre Corone, the one who Immanuel, in a way, would have been most congenial with if they could hang out together was Boccaccio. You know, because when you think about it, I mean, not just because of, what they wrote. I don't know, I can't read the Mapparo, so I can't really speak to that. But think about Boccaccio and Leonzio Pilato. Think about Boccaccio's relationship with the Byzantine translator who Petrarch brought in to translate Homer from the Greek. Think about how Petrarch really just really was kind of disgusted by Leonzio. Petrarch was really, he really badly wanted that translation. He wanted Homer in Latin, but he did not want so much of Leonzio. And he was kind of repulsed by him, apparently. Whereas Boccaccio, he lived with Boccaccio. Boccaccio hosted him in his own home. He opened his home to Leonzio, and Leonzio worked on the translation while living with Boccaccio. And you can only imagine kind of the breakfast table conversations that these guys had. Well, imagine if that was Immanuel. Right? Imagine if somehow Immanuel and Boccaccio were contemporaries, and for some reason they ended up in each other's circles, and Boccaccio was hosted Immanuel instead of Leonzio. Imagine, I wonder if Boccaccio would have been so severe in his old age and would have drawn back quite so drawn back so far away from the kind of ribald things that he wrote when he was a younger man. I wonder if, I bet you the two of them would have egged each other on. would have come up with some really interesting kind of imaginative narrative confections as a result of their conversations. And that's kind of the counterfactual history that I've been nourishing. This is my fanfic that I'm going to write on the flight home from this conference about Boccaccio and Immanuel. And with that, I'll close, and thank you again, Davide.
And then we close asking Serena Di Nepi, who has been here many times, and she's from the University of Roma, La Sapienza, and wrote, she's a scholar.
She would say that instead.
No, I am not going to say that. I won't do that. Serena wrote many books, and but for me, like she brought a really different perspective on the studies of the creation of the ghetto of Rome, and she gave really insight in how the community and the leadership of the community reacted to this traumatic episode, and that would last almost 5 centuries, and she also gave a very interesting perspective on the context in which this happened. And this is very much, I think, is something really important in what we're trying to do with Immanuel, instead of leaving him confined to a figure, an I narrative, to try to build them also through the eyes of others and through illuminating the context in which he lived. So please welcome Serena Di Nepi.
First of all, let me say thank you to Natalia and to Casa Italiana for having me back again. It is always a pleasure to stay here. I've spoken here different time in different years, and I'm very happy and honored for the occasion to coming back after the pandemic. Today, I'm going more or less to think about the legacy of Immanuel and the way we can encapsulate him and his works, and the way my colleagues are starting to study him in recent historiography, and maybe even in the new scholarly path about Italian ghettoization and about the Italian experience of the Jews in early modern. That is starting to focus on the political issues. Our idea is that it's not enough to consider the Jews only a religious, marginalized, excluded, and a bit depressed group. There is something more. They were part of the society after, in the Counter-Reformation time, in a specific part of the town during the night, but they participated in daily life on different and various levels. It was not only the possibility to stay, to be part of the economic events, but they were part of the community in a very early modern way, as a separated but included one, and for this reason they played even a political role. I think that Immanuel and the way we consider Immanuel could offer important clues to this different scholarly approach. The first one is in the historiography of Immanuel, and in the moment when Immanuel has been rediscovered by scholars. That was not for case, in my opinion. At the beginning of the Wissenschaft des Judentum, it was part of the work by Samuel David Luzzatto in Italy, in the Collegio Rabbinico, and it answered perfectly their issues and their cultural agenda at that time. They were Jews of the modern time. They were Jews who were living out of the ghetto. They were trying to set a scientific way to investigate Jewish history, and they were more or less the first to rediscover the possibility of making Jewish history in a scientific way. And the Jewish Dante, who had lived in the Republican Rome of the 14th century, fits perfectly the task. Immanuel, according to them, was a man of his time, acted as a man of his time, and wrote as a man of his time. I will add, he wrote as a Jewish man of his time. It's so interesting to make a point about the different languages he was using. He using differently Italian and Hebrew, but he says different. Of course, as any Jewish scholars and any Jewish author in history, he says different things according to the language of the audience he was addressing. If we come back again to the moment when Immanuel has been rediscovered by historiography, he worked as a prisma, as a filter to look to different time. It was as a filter for the Middle Ages and the golden era, the medieval golden era of Jewish community of Rome, and for this reason, he could be considered the negative coin of the later period, of the ghettoization, of the dark era of the golden of the Jewish, of the Roman Jewish community. On one side, the author, the Talmudic academists, and Rome as one of the most important cultural hub of Jewish studies in the Mediterranean. On the other side, the era of nothing, the era of the time of persecution and of cultural poorness. This was the way they spoke to him in the time of, in the beginning of the 19th century up to the 20th century. But if we try to reframe this and to destructure this and we go within things, we find something different. Immanuel was part of the ruling class of the Jewish community of his time, not for case. He was trained. He was a very educated man. He knew languages, and he was able to write in different languages to came across different relationships. In the very famous sonnet that before me, Dario has just recalled, he spoke of the political turmoil of his time, neither with Orsini nor with Colonna, and there is Ghibellini in Bologna and Guelfi in other towns. Now, he was offering in Italian, and I think that we should consider that the fact that he was writing in Italian, so he was aiming at being understood not by Jews, but by the Christian audience, he was saying that he knows what is going on. He is not taking part because he is Jew, and he is proud to be Jew, and he knows that he should be more prudent and more cautious than other people of the time for this reason, and he offered a political agenda and a political manifesto to his co-religionists by, on the other side, offering a quiet, tranquil, a quiet and reliable partner to the Christian ones. That was more or less the political agenda of Jews in pre-modern time, no? To be part, to be considered, to be ready to negotiate if needed, and do not be an issue in the local context. That is more or less to overcome the traditional image that we have of the vertical alliance between the Jews and the top and the apex of the institution, but the idea that the Jews should be able to negotiate at different level and to make different relationship in the different and complicated hierarchy of their own time. And they should be aware of this, and they should often thinking about this. That was what Immanuel says, what the ruling class of the Jewish community at the beginning of the ghetto era did, what an extraordinary scholar such as Azaria de Rossi, the inventor of modern Jewish historiography, suggested them to do when speaking on the relationship between the Jews in the ghetto time and their ruling class. Thank you.
Siediti qui così. So I would invite, we're open to a few questions before we close. I would invite our speakers to sit here, and we'll take a few questions from the public, and then we close. Oh, we're short of chairs, but I'm sorry, but someone will bring one. So I wonder if someone would like to, please.
Yeah, I was wondering, you had mentioned, Natalia, about the influence from the south, from Sicily. I'm wondering if you could touch upon that and the correspondence that took place there.
Maybe Fabrizio, now that I launched it and now you're stuck with it.
But, so who wants to answer? What I can say, I mean, when Natalia, I guess, was thinking about Sicily, I think she was referring to the Kingdom of Sicily.
Well, I was also thinking about Puglia. And,
yes, of course. So Kingdom of Sicily is a geographical medieval idea that includes the whole of the south of the peninsula, not only the island of Sicily, but also the southernmost part of the peninsula. And the official title of the kingdom was Kingdom of Sicily, even when Sicily was separated from the rest of the southernmost part of the peninsula. Anyway, so the connection between Immanuel's literary production and the southern Italian communities, Jewish communities, was very important, all the more so since the community of Rome had been borrowing for many centuries motifs, intellectual motifs, that had been originated from southern Italian Jewish academies, especially the so-called Apulian academies, and other motifs that the Apulian academies themselves had introduced into the Western Jewish communities from the easternmost lands of Israel and Babylon, for instance, and Egypt as well. So my reading of this very complex phenomenon, intellectual phenomenon, is that In a way, the community of Rome, what we call the community of Rome from an intellectual point of view, was kind of recipient, was a sort of recipient of those, that enormous legacy of traditions that the southern Italian communities from earlier periods had brought from the easternmost lands or produced themselves in southern Italy. And the relation with Rome was very, very close. Can I give you an example, for instance, which is, in my opinion, is very important? So I'll be dealing with that tomorrow, hopefully, in my paper. But for instance, this very important the many important accounts that appear in Immanuel's literary production, and by account I mean tales, like folk tales. Many of those tales can be seen as derived from a very strong interest in these traditional folk tales, which were imported from the land of Israel or Babylon into the area of Apulia, into the Apulian academies. And from the Apulian academies, they were later taken to Rome. Okay? On the other hand, the Apulian academies, for instance, were responsible for merging Eastern traditions which appear in the so-called midrashic, rabbinic literary production, and Latin or Italian folk motifs. Again, I'm giving you an example, in my opinion, very interesting. You all know that there's this very important history of Rome related to Aeneas. I think in English it's Aeneas. Aeneas. So, you know, Aeneas is the supposedly the founder of Rome, and so on and so forth. And Virgil was the poet that made Aeneas so popular even in the Middle Ages. And you all know that Dante draws upon Virgil as his guide into the realm of hell and purgatorio and so on and so forth, because Virgil had written the Aeneid, whatever. Aeneid, okay, whatever. So the interesting thing that I think most people ignore is that in the Southern Apulian academies, they had mixed up the midrashic attitude of reading the major fight between Jacob and Esau, with the story of Aeneas. The idea was that Esau, you know the story, Esau was Edom, was red-haired. And Edom was also one of the names that was given to Rome. So everything connected with red, everything connected with Edom and the Edomites was negative because it was related to Rome. They had conquered the land of Israel and destroyed the Temple of Jerusalem. You know the story. Now, the interesting thing that the Italian communities, since they were related to Rome in a way, in a positive way, wanted to stress the fact that even Aeneas was a descendant of Esau. And so they created this sort of new forgery according to which Aeneas was the grandson of Esau. And they made a very interesting interpretation, narrative interpretation, which included a lot of legends, mythological legends issued in the Latin production made into Hebrew. So it's very interesting because they were absorbing, the southern Italian communities were absorbing motifs from the East and absorbing motifs from the Latin tradition and making them into something new, which later became the foundation of the intellectual legacy of the community of Rome in the following period. And Immanuel is the heir of these traditions. I don't know if I've been clear. I'm just giving an example. So when we read the Makhbarot, some of the motifs that appear in the Makhbarot are certainly related to Arabic literature and the Maqamat literature that Karla was mentioning before, okay? Which was very popular in Italy also in those days, in Hebrew translations, so on and so forth. But they were also eager, the Jewish community was also eager to demonstrate that they were aware of this mythological literature turned into Hebrew. And so they were putting everything together and they created something new, which Immanuel was very aware of. So he was very creative, but at the same time, he was just adapting traditional forms of literature that came mostly through the southern Italy to Rome. Is this clear? Did I answer your question? Okay.
That's fine. You made your job.
So,
My job. Okay.
so not to make sort of this go into even more detail, but I am just a little curious about this question of influence between sort of the Pulean Yeshivot and that world, but also, you know, this is the beginnings, one would say, of a really Italian Kabbalistic tradition. And I'm just curious sort of how we weigh these different things. And you also have, one might think, sort of this larger, more established Sicilian community with its own traditions. And I'm just wondering how those things make their way in, we think, to Immanuel's world, and kind of what you make of what's a bigger influence and a lesser.
Okay, that's a wonderful question, and it's absolutely one of my major subjects of research, because I'm mainly interested in the reception of Kabbalistic motifs in late medieval Italy. And so a very interesting figure that is closely related directly to Emanuele Romano is a famous kind of, for us, it's famous, but maybe not that much, philosopher whose name is Hillel ben Shmuel of Verona. Probably nobody has ever heard of him. Anyway, he was kind of famous philosopher. Now, so this guy came from northern Italy, apparently from an Ashkenazi background, or at least he was charged for being too much Ashkenazi by Immanuel's generation, because there was like today, there was a sort of very strong fight between the Italian community, the Roman community, and the Ashkenazim that were coming down to Italy already in those days. Okay, so however, even if he was an Ashkenazi scholar, he was very interested in the Maimonidean understanding of the scripture. And so, for some reasons that we don't understand really why, but it's probably evident that there was an interest in that, he opened a sort of yeshiva, or some kind of school, addressing Jewish students coming from all over, in Naples, or in the area of Naples. And among, this you might know, and among the most famous students that he had in this yeshiva was Avraham Abulafia. Have you ever heard of Avraham Abulafia? Please say yes. Yes, okay. So Avraham Abulafia, you might know, he was a Spanish, so to say, Aragonese scholar who thought he was a sort of messiah or sort of messianic figure. And he, in my opinion, not by chance, decided to spend a long time of his life both in the peninsular southern Italy and then in Sicily, and later in Sicily, where he most probably died. And the reason why Hillel of Verona was so important in Abulafia's life was that Hillel taught a Spaniard how to read Maimonides. So it's unbelievable. An Ashkenazi scholar who theoretically should have been totally against the Maimonidean interpretation of Torah, but he was in Italy and in Rome especially. Then he went south to Naples and he received students from all over the diaspora, and especially Avram Abulafia, whom we know of, and he taught a Spanish guy how to read Maimonides. And Abulafia was so interested in Hillel's understanding of Maimonides that Abulafia decided to merge Maimonides and his own understanding of the mystical trends of thought he had received while in Spain. And possibly, this is not clear, he also used a lot of Ashkenazi motifs, and we don't know Abulafia, and we don't know whether some scholars say that Barcelona in those days was the center for this Ashkenazi exchange, but Hillel might have been the guy who taught him also about this Ashkenazim, these Hasidei Ashkenaz traditions that came into Italy in those days. And the result of that was that Abulafian Kabbalah came to Rome, arrived to Rome, and the very first scribes, Sofrim, that copied Abulafia's treatises lived in Rome in the early 14th century, because the community of Rome was very much interested in this new fashion of Kabbalistic motifs that was imported from other areas of the Mediterranean. And you might have heard of one of the most important Kabbalistic scholars, right from the community of Rome, Menachem of Recanati, who founded the real Kabbalistic tradition for later generations of Italian scholars, both Jews and non-Jews. And of course, he lived in Rome. He studied Kabbalah while in Rome. So, I don't know if this was clear, but the very interesting thing, and then I stop because, of course, I could speak a lot about this subject, as you understand. The interesting thing is that Maimonides, at the very end of the story, Maimonides became the hero of Kabbalah, of Italian Kabbalah, which is incredible. Understand? Yeah, ironic, absolutely. So every Kabbalist, every Italian Kabbalist tried his utmost to demonstrate that Maimonides himself was a Kabbalist. And the interesting thing is that when Christians started being interested in Kabbalah, they read Kabbalah through Maimonides. Amazing. But Abulafia, as you might know, wrote 3 different commentaries on Moreh Nevuchim, on the Guide of the Perplexed, 3 different commentaries, Kabbalistic commentaries. Yeah?
I think we have time for one question, and then perhaps I have one.
This is a very complicated question, and there are very different, No, let's put it this way. Kabbalah can be considered Kabbalah is a very general term that means a lot of things. The Kabbalah, I think you probably are referring to, meaning sort of secret discipline tradition. It was the production of intellectual circles.
In Spain.
Exactly. You said it. You said it. And Menachem al-Rekanati was one of the very first people in Italy that introduced the Sefer HaZohar and the Kabbalistic writings by Moshe de Leon into Italy.
The question is, would they have read the Zohar? Would Abulafia, or in fact, Moses, Immanuel Haromi, was he aware of it?
Yes, he was. Yes, he was.
Coming from Spain, not just from the East, and not just from Maimonides.
The fact was that the intellectual milieu of the Roman community of Rome was very much influenced from all possible directions of the diaspora. And you might be familiar with Avram ibn Ezra, and Avram ibn Ezra was in Rome himself. And traditionally, we ascribe to Avram ibn Ezra's stay in Rome the Judeo-Arabic trend of poetry that became so common in Immanuel's time. And as a matter of fact, Immanuel uses both the Judeo-Arabic tradition and the Italian tradition. And again, what we were saying about legends or Kabbalah or everything, the idea as Rome was a sort of melting pot of these diverse motifs.
This
Yeah.
was the city at the time.
This was the New York of the period, exactly.
I think we have to close. I'm sorry to say so. We'll continue the conversation at
But there is one more question.
One more question.
one more question.
My question, is any of his work still extant anywhere and available in any anthologies?
Immanuel's work?
Yes, his literary work, right.
Yes. So I know that not his biblical commentaries. They haven't been. There's. I know various people are working on the commentaries. There are not trend.
There are some Italian translations, for instance, of the commentary in Genesis.
In Genesis, yeah.
And Job, the whole, and you know.
There are so selected translations into Italian, less into English. The there are poems. So Yehuda Cohn, yes, yeah. And that's a huge undertaking because of just what Fabrizio was saying about the complexity of this kind of lyric, which was a sonnet written in Hebrew, so it takes into account different meters, syllabic and quantitative, and Yehuda was able to reconcile this in his translation of a translation. I mean, it's a series of translated steps, so we're looking forward to that as well.
Kind of biblical Hebrew. It's not widely known that Hebrew was the second language of sonnets after Italian. Hundreds of years before Shakespeare, he was writing sonnets in Hebrew.
And in the fall, we'll present and they will be reading.
And tell them how the sonnet, the form, the magic form of sonnet was translated into Hebrew.
Yeah. These are sonnets in every sense of the word. 14 lines. They follow the model of Dante, of Petrarch, and they are written in Hebrew. It's really quite remarkable and biblical.
So I will a closing question, which is for Dario and Davide, how you want to answer about. Tell us something about the popes during the time of Immanuel. This is a period in which, we're used to learn about how the popes, during the Ghetto era, were, ruling in favor or against all sort of, over segregated Jewish communities. But this is a time in Rome that is a little different from what
Yes,
comes after.
probably we didn't mention the main problem in Rome during the 14th century. And the problem is that the popes are far from Rome, because starting from 1305, the popes are in Avignon. This means many things, starting from the fact that before the 14th century, popes were not only the religious center of Europe, but they were also a strong political power. Central Italy was, in fact, the papal state, and the papal state was based for the popes, of course, on the so-called Constantine donation. And there's a very broad topic to address. Sorry, I have no time to say, but this meant that the city of Rome, politically speaking, was really strange if we compare it to other cities, because the main political structure was the commune for the city and its contado, the so-called rural landscape outside the walls. But it was also the center of a monarchical state, the papal states, and so there were a conflict, a struggle between the popes and the commune. And in period like the realm of Boniface VIII, around the end of the 13th and the early 14th centuries, there were a kind of overlapping between the commune and the popes. And the popes were able to appoint the senators, the governor. So when the popes shifted to Avignon, Rome was... Scholars said, okay, Rome was a kind of desert. The Tre Corone say that Rome was a kind of lupanare. No, lupanare was Umberto Eco, sorry, but it's kind of the same. Umberto Eco is the fourth corona, is the fourth crown. But this was important from a political point of view, because the barons became weak and the popolo gained strength. So this made possible a change in political arena, probably made possible even a change for the Jews, but I leave the microphone.
This was an important change in the relationship between the Curia, between the popes and the Jews, because during the 13th century, the popes had established important economic contacts with the Jewish Roman merchants, which became stronger and stronger. We can say that, let's say like that the popes used the Jewish Roman merchants as actors in the communes around Rome in order to consolidate the Roman power and influence on the Perugia, Assisi, and the other communes in the state. So when the Pope left, they changed their attitude and they closed they interrupted the alliance with the Roman Jews because of the French mentality, which was strongly influenced by an anti-Jewish attitude.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank our speakers. Thank you for coming. Thanks to Casa Italiana and NYU and the University of Rome La Sapienza. And please stay tuned for more Immanuel to come. Thank you. Have a good night.